The smell had been there for months. The neighbors at the Oxford Apartments on North 25th Street in Milwaukee had been living with it for long enough that some of them had stopped fully noticing it, the way people stop noticing the noise from a highway after a few weeks. But new visitors noticed. People coming for the first time to the building would stop in the corridor and look around and ask what that smell was. The neighbors would say they did not know, that they had complained, that nothing had been done. The man in apartment 213 always had an explanation. There was meat in the refrigerator that had gone bad. There was a problem with the drains. He was sorry about the inconvenience. He was always sorry about the inconvenience. He was quiet and polite, and his apologies were the kind that made people feel vaguely guilty for having raised the issue in the first place. His name was Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer. He was 31 years old. He had been living in that apartment for 2 years. He had been killing people for 13 years. When police entered apartment 213 on the night of July 22nd, 1991, they found the remains of 11 human beings. There was a head in the refrigerator. There were skulls in a filing cabinet. There was a 57-gallon blue barrel containing dissolved human remains in the corner of the bedroom. There were photographs. There were tools. There was evidence of a sustained, methodical operation that had been running in a residential apartment building in a populated urban neighborhood for 2 years, while neighbors complained about smells and sounds and a general unease they could not fully name, and while the city of Milwaukee went about its business around it. 17 people in total, 13 years. One apartment building at the end. This is not the story that most people think they know. Most people think they know the Jeffrey Dahmer story because they have seen the Netflix series, or heard the podcast, or read the summaries. What most of those retellings share is a particular emphasis on the psychology of the killer, on the grotesque details of what was found, on the spectacle of the trial. What they tend to underemphasize or avoid entirely is the other story. The story that runs parallel to Dahmer's, and that is, in some ways, more important for understanding what this case actually means. The story of the 17 chances the system had to intervene and did not take. Jeffrey Dahmer was born on May 21st, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. His childhood, by the accounts available, was marked by a combination of factors that appear frequently in the histories of people who become what he became, though it is important to say clearly that those factors are neither necessary nor sufficient causes. Many people with similar childhoods do not become killers. The factors are context, not explanation. His parents' marriage was troubled. His mother, Joyce, suffered from significant mental health struggles and was hospitalized at various points during his childhood. His father, Lionel, was frequently absent due to work and the demands of managing a household in increasing distress. Jeffrey was, for significant periods, left largely to himself. He became interested in dead things at an early age. Animals, primarily. He would collect roadkill, bleach the bones, keep the specimens. His father noticed this and later recalled feeling uncertain about how to respond to it, whether it was a morbid hobby of the kind that some children develop and grow out of, or something that warranted more concern. He chose to believe it was the former. In high school, Dahmer was quiet and socially marginal. He drank. He had begun drinking heavily by his mid-teens, which would be a consistent feature of his life until his arrest. He graduated in 1978, and within weeks of graduation, committed his first murder. The victim was Stephen Hicks. He was 18 years old. He was hitchhiking home from a concert when Dahmer picked him up. Dahmer brought him to his parents' house. His parents were away at the time, and when Hicks said he wanted to leave, Dahmer struck him with a barbell and strangled him. He buried the body in the woods behind the house. He later dug up the remains crushed the bones, and scattered them in the woods. He was 18 years old. He had just graduated high school, and he had just committed a murder that would not be connected to him for 13 years. After the murder, Dahmer's life followed a pattern of drift and disruption. He attended Ohio State University briefly and dropped out. He enlisted in the Army and was discharged after 2 years, in part because of his drinking. He moved to Miami for a short period. He moved back to Ohio. He moved in with his grandmother in West Allis, Wisconsin. The years between 1978 and 1987 are the years that the investigation later called the dormant period. There is one confirmed murder during this time, a man named Stephen Tuomi, killed in 1987 at a hotel room in Milwaukee. Dahmer later claimed he did not fully remember committing this murder, which investigators treated with appropriate skepticism. Whether he was being truthful about his memory or strategically managing his account, the result is the same. One confirmed murder in 9 years, followed by a dramatic acceleration. Between 1987 and his arrest in July of 1991, Dahmer killed 16 more people. 16 murders in approximately 4 years. The pace increased as the period went on. In the final year before his arrest, he was killing roughly once a month. The acceleration is something that researchers in criminal psychology have studied extensively in Dahmer's case, and that has contributed to the understanding of what is sometimes called the cooling-off period in serial offender behavior, the time between crimes that varies by individual and that tends to shorten as the behavior becomes more practiced, more habitual, more normalized within the offender's own psychology. For the families of the victims killed in the final year, the acceleration is not an academic observation. It is the fact that the system had, by that point, accumulated multiple specific opportunities to intervene and had not taken them. Most of Dahmer's Milwaukee victims were Black or Asian men, many of them gay or bisexual, many of them from communities that had learned, through long experience, that going to police about concerns often produced limited results and sometimes produced additional problems. This is not a neutral observation about the case. It is a structural fact about who was being killed and why the disappearances did not generate the kind of immediate, sustained investigative response that other types of missing persons cases sometimes generate. The families of Dahmer's victims reported their relatives missing. The reports were filed. Most of them were not actively pursued as potential homicide investigations. This pattern, the differential in how missing persons reports are pursued based on the demographics of the missing person, was not unique to Milwaukee in 1990. It was not unique to any particular city or police department. It was a documented feature of how missing persons resources were allocated across the country, driven by a combination of institutional assumptions, media coverage patterns, and the structural relationship between law enforcement and the communities most affected. What makes the Dahmer case a particularly clear illustration of this pattern is the specificity of the missed opportunities. It is not just that the system failed in some general diffuse way. It failed in specific documented moments, with specific documented people, making specific documented decisions. The most documented of these moments is the night of May 27, 1991. 2 women, Sandra Smith and Nicole Childress, found a young boy wandering on the street near the Oxford Apartments. He was naked. He was bleeding from wounds that the women could see. He was disoriented in a way that was clearly not ordinary intoxication. He could not respond to their questions coherently. The women called 911. Officers John Balkerzak and Joseph Gabrish arrived. Dahmer arrived shortly after, identifying himself as the boy's friend and explaining that it was a domestic dispute, that the boy was 19 years old, that he lived in his apartment. He was calm. He was coherent. He was, by the accounts of the officers who later testified, convincing. The women who had called 911 did not find him convincing. One of them later testified that she told the officers something was wrong, that the boy was not okay, that the man claiming he was his friend was not being truthful. The officers' accounts of what she said vary from the account she and the other witness gave. The officers walked with Dahmer and the boy to apartment 213. They did not run Dahmer's name through the system, which would have returned a 1989 conviction for child molestation, a conviction that had resulted in a sentence of work release and probation, a sentence that Dahmer was currently serving, a sentence that meant he was not supposed to have unsupervised contact with minors. They did not run the name. They walked to the apartment. They noted the smell. They found the explanation for the smell. Dahmer told them there was meat in the refrigerator that had gone bad. Satisfactory. One of them briefly looked into the bedroom. In the bedroom, in a location visible from the doorway, was the head of a man named Tony Hughes, who had been murdered 3 days earlier. The officer did not see it, or saw it, and did not register what he was seeing, or registered what he was seeing and made a decision about it that has never been fully explained. The officers left. The boy was Konerak Sinthasomphone. He was 14 years old. He was the son of a Laotian immigrant family who had moved to Milwaukee. He was not 19. He was not Dahmer's roommate. He had already been drugged. Dahmer had given him a sedative-laced drink earlier that evening, and the disorientation and confusion the women had observed was not intoxication. It was the effects of the drug. Within an hour of the officers leaving, Konerak Sinthasomphone was dead. The officers were later dismissed from the Milwaukee Police Department following an internal review. One of them was subsequently reinstated through an arbitration process. The other's case went through a different legal process. Their names appeared in the public record, were reported in the coverage, and are available for anyone who wants to know them. The name that matters more, in terms of what this case represents, is Konerak Sinthasomphone. He was 14 years old. He had escaped. He had been found by 2 women who knew something was wrong. He had been returned. There is no way to write that sentence in a way that makes it easier to hold. There is no framing that softens the specific weight of what happened on that street in Milwaukee on May 27, 1991. He was 14 years old. He had escaped. And then the system sent him back. Dahmer was arrested on July 22, 1991. The circumstances of his arrest were, in a way, as specific and contingent as the circumstances that should have led to his arrest months earlier. A man named Tracy Edwards had gone to Dahmer's apartment. Edwards was larger and stronger than most of Dahmer's previous victims, and when Dahmer attempted to restrain him, Edwards managed to fight free and run from the apartment with a handcuff still attached to one wrist. He flagged down a police car on the street. Officers Robert Routh and Rolf Mueller returned to the apartment with him. Dahmer initially attempted the same calm, explanatory approach that had worked before. It did not work this time, because Tracy Edwards was standing in the room describing what had happened, and because one of the officers walked to the bedroom and saw the Polaroid photographs that Dahmer had taken of his victims, and that were lying in open view. The arrest happened within minutes. The search of the apartment that followed was conducted over several hours and produced evidence that the officers involved have described in interviews in the years since as unlike anything they had encountered in their careers. The specificity of what was found, The preserved skulls, the photographs, the barrel, the contents of the refrigerator created a picture of sustained, methodical, documented violence that had been occurring in that apartment for 2 years. 17 victims in total, ranging in age from 14 to 33. Most of them young men from Milwaukee's Black and Southeast Asian communities. Most of them gay or bisexual. Many of them reported missing by families who had been told, in one form or another, that their concerns were being noted. Dahmer was charged with 15 counts of murder in Wisconsin, 2 earlier murders in Ohio, and 1 at a Milwaukee hotel fell under different jurisdictions. He pled guilty to avoid the death penalty, which Wisconsin did not have. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, a total of 957 years. He was incarcerated at the Columbia Correctional Institution. On November 28, 1994, he was beaten to death by a fellow inmate named Christopher Scarver while on a work detail. He was 34 years old. The case that followed his arrest did not end with his sentencing. It continued in the form of civil suits brought by the families of his victims against the city of Milwaukee, related to the decision to return Konerak Sinthasomphone to the apartment. The city eventually settled a number of those suits. It continued in the form of policy changes at the Milwaukee Police Department and at other departments across the country. Changes to how domestic disturbance calls involving potential victims are handled. Changes to protocols for running background checks. Changes to the training given to officers responding to calls involving disoriented or distressed individuals. These changes were real. They came at a cost that should not have been necessary to pay. The families of the 17 victims have navigated the decades since the case in different ways. Some have become advocates, working on issues of police accountability or missing persons policy or LGBTQ safety. Some have given interviews. Some have declined all public engagement with the case, preferring to hold their grief privately, away from the machinery of true crime coverage that has treated their relatives' deaths as content. Their preferences deserve respect. Their names, the names of the 17, deserve to be in the room whenever the case of Jeffrey Dahmer is discussed. Not because it diminishes what he did to hold them alongside the perpetrator's story, but because the opposite, treating them as background to his story, is a choice, and it is the wrong one. Errol Lindsay. He was 19 years old. He was killed in April of 1991. His sister, Rita Isbell, gave a victim impact statement at the sentencing that was one of the most viscerally affecting pieces of testimony in the entire proceedings. In 2022, when the Netflix series on Dahmer was released without consultation with victim families, she gave an interview describing what it was like to learn that her brother's story had been turned into entertainment without anyone asking. Tony Hughes. He was 31 years old. He was deaf and mute. He communicated through written notes and lip reading. He was killed in May of 1991, 3 days before Konerak Sinthasomphone. His remains were in the bedroom when the officers walked Konerak back to the apartment. Konerak Sinthasomphone. 14 years old. He had escaped. The record of what happened to him after he was returned is complete, and it does not get easier to read, no matter how many times you encounter it. These are 3 names from 17. Each of the 17 has the same weight, a specific life, a specific family, a specific future that was taken in an apartment on North 25th Street in Milwaukee, while the city went about its business around it. What the Jeffrey Dahmer case gave to American law enforcement and criminal justice policy is real and important. The policy changes, the updated protocols, the increased attention to the demographics of missing persons reports, and the allocation of investigative resources, these matter. They do not retroactively protect the people who needed protection before those changes existed. There is a thing that the families of victims in high-profile cases have said in various forms across multiple decades and multiple cases that I think is worth saying plainly here. The attention that comes after, the documentaries, the books, the Netflix series, the podcasts, the true crime content, arrives without warning, often without consent, and takes something that belongs to a family and turns it into something that belongs to an audience. Some families find that attention useful. It keeps the names alive. It creates pressure for accountability. It reaches people who might otherwise never know what happened. Other families find it extractive. It profits from their loss. It does not ask permission. It arrives decades later, when the family has built a life carefully around the grief, and it tears the careful construction open again. Dark record is part of that ecosystem. I am not going to pretend otherwise. This documentary exists because the Jeffrey Dahmer case is one of the most well-documented cases in American criminal history, and because the questions it raises about systemic failure, about whose safety is treated as urgent, about the gap between the system's stated function and its actual behavior, are questions that deserve to be in the public conversation. But the reason to hold those questions is not the killer. It is the 17 names. Errol Lindsay deserves to be remembered. Tony Hughes deserves to be remembered. Konerak Sinthasomphone deserves to be remembered. All 17 deserve to be remembered, not as victims of Jeffrey Dahmer, not as characters in someone else's story, but as people who had lives and families and futures, and who deserved to have the system that existed specifically to protect them actually do that. It did not. That is the record. The smell had been there for months, and nobody came. That is where this record ends.